All right, welcome back again. Today we're going to be covering IB Psychology's Abnormal Level of Analysis Learning Outcome 5.6, which is titled Discuss Cultural and Gender Variations in Prevalence of Disorder. And let's go back to the definition of prevalence again. This was right in your study guide. It's a statistical concept in medicine or psychiatry. It refers to the percentage of individuals within a population who are affected by a specific disorder at a given time. Okay? So let's go ahead and continue on. I popped in a PowerPoint here for you so we can talk in the background. Less writing, so you don't have to see my sloppy handwriting. Here we go. Here we're taking a look at the Weisman study of '96. He looked at cultural variations, or they looked at cultural variations. I don't know if Weisman was a man or a woman. They looked at 10 countries. They ranged from 19% in Beirut, Lebanon, to about 1.5% in Taiwan. And what we're talking about here is the prevalence of depression, the occurrence of depression in those particular countries. I'll come back to Beirut here in just a few minutes. Korea had a prevalence rate of 2.9, Paris 16.4, and women had a higher rate than men in all countries examined. Cultural reluctance to report as well as methodological limitations may account for some differences. But the study was done in 1996. Of note here, we have to look at here when we look at this is that when we look at the 96 study, we have to examine what was going on in the world in 1996. In Beirut, Lebanon, the country was just coming out of an internal civil war. This may account for the 19% that we're examining here with regard to the number of people suffering from depression. That 19% may be an arbitrary level. Again here, 1.5% in Taiwan, 2.9% in Korea. Remember, I had said to you earlier in the year that you're going to find that there are huge cultural differences when it comes to countries reporting out depression and what they define to be as depression in their own manner. And so as a result of that, Taiwan, Korea, both being Eastern countries or Asian countries, have a tendency to be a little bit more reluctant when it comes to actually defining depression the way we would do in Western societies. So we may be looking at artificially inflated or deflated values. All right, continuing on. I don't know why that word loading is in the background. Continuing on with the idea of prevalence of depression, in the Marcellus study of 2002, they argued that depression has long been a major topic of concern in Western medical history, but now it seems that it is becoming the world's foremost psychiatric problem. And this demonstrates evidence that the rate of depressions are increasing, particularly in individuals born after the Second World War. Marcella opens up a particularly big bag of worms, if you will, when it comes to looking at depression in the postmodern age. It's an historical reference that I'm giving to you, postmodern age. And World War II happens to define the postmodernist era. And what happens here is that we have, Marcella goes into this in their study, that they believe, and they aren't able to demonstrate it, okay? They believe that postmodern technologies, think about the technologies we have today, think about how this is coming to you without me standing in front of you in a classroom. This is coming to you via an electronic media, via the cloud. All this changes the way we see things. The advent of the internet and information at 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. There's more information than we could humanly process in our lifetimes being flooded to us. And all this can add to other types of social disorders, not to exclude depression, but it could. Continuing on, in the Dutton 2009 study, they were able to find that cultural variations in the prevalence of depression. In the Santoris study of 83, they found that there is a substantial cultural difference in the stigma associated with mental health problems. This particular study still has a great deal. We find that there is still a great deal of stigma associated with mental health disorders. And again, back to the Marcellus study of 95, proposed that urban settings are associated with increased stress due to problems of housing, work, marriage, close proximity to one another, living conditions, quality of life issues, etc., etc., etc. Marcella focuses primarily on the social cultural aspects of the prevalence of depression than anything else. All right, and the review guide also covers these studies as well too. Moving on. Now we're going to take a look at a slight difference here. We're going to look at gender variations, and the Nolan whole schema, a 2001 study, simply put that women, the occurrence or the prevalence of depression among women, this was a U.S. Study, by the way, was about 10 to 25%, as men are 5 to 12%. And the National Comorbidity Study showed that 1.7% of American women for every man has experienced at least one episode of depression. Roughly the same ratio has been found in recent studies in 9 other countries, including Canada, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. So this study right here is a pretty good example as showing across the board relationship between depression and across modern countries, Canada and Germany, and Asian countries, Japan and modern, and rising industrialized nations, Brazil. So there's some relevance here. I'm going to pause here for a moment. Okay, back again. Here we're looking at the variations in gender again, and let's take in consideration biological factors. Hormones are the ones that generally should come to mind when you're going to talk about gender variations and the prevalence of depression. We go back to the Nolan Hoschema study of 2001, and here they kind of tend to have a tendency to stick their foot into matters here by stating that it appears to contradict the former idea that estrogen and progesterone, sex hormones, okay, are likely to be keys in the mood of women. This study states that there is very little evidence to support this idea. This particular statement right here in the study, oops, I'm moving this around. In the study right here, actually opened up quite a bit of discussion among others when it came out, even in 2001, that estrogen and progesterone don't play a role in mood. Well, there is little evidence, okay, little evidence to support this idea that these sex hormones are a factor in mood, okay? Women and men, it says here, women and men face same stressors but approach them in different ways. So we could say that, hey, it happens, but how do we deal with it? How do we socially or cognitively deal with the presence of these biological factors? Down here at the bottom, let me just slide this up a little bit here. Down here at the bottom, we're looking at the same study that demonstrated that women have less power and status than men in most societies, making them most vulnerable or more vulnerable to a host of social problems. This, you're not going to find much in the way of argument from me about this one. You'll find that even though we are well into the 21st century, we've got a long way to go when it comes to the status of women when comparing it to men. And so this may have, this particular point may have a contributing factor. I don't have the evidence, still relatively new. This is a real good area for some of you who are thinking about going into this field to consider. Okay, moving on. Here we're looking at the cultural differences, the prevalence of depression. Let's take a look at some of these reported areas. Seattle, Washington has a prevalence rate of 6.3. China, 4%. Here again, is it artificially deflated here? Verona, Italy, 4.7. In Germany, 15.9, UK, almost 17%, Turkey, almost 12%, and Nagasaki, almost 3%. It's an interesting prevalence rate across the board here. This is just some statistics I thought I'd throw out there for. So why are there cultural differences in prevalence of disorders? Different cultures have different concepts of what is abnormal behavior. Remember, what is abnormal for us here in the United States or in Western society as a general rule may not be abnormal in some other country. We have to understand that. Odd behavior in another country may dictate to us that we are in fact dealing with that should be classified as abnormal psychology, but in fact it is completely normal. So social problems, pressures, and culture differences may lead to a higher prevalence of disorders in some cultures, or a lower, prevalence. In many cultures, in many societies of China, you don't bring out your crazy. You don't bring out your crazy people. You keep the crazy people in the family. You don't report it. It's not their problem. It's not the state's problem. It's the family's problem. And the family addresses the problem. That's how it's handled. Okay? Moving on. Here we say that different cultures have different concepts of what abnormal behavior is about. Now, here, I've just posted some studies that are not necessarily in your study guide. I know that for the most part, I don't think they're in any of your textbooks. This is material I had that I wanted to make you aware of that adds a little bit of flavor to a better understanding of cultural differences in abnormal behavior. You have this study up here, the first one, Okello study in 2006 that looked at Uganda and Africa with regard to depression. It was seen as an illness of thoughts and not a biological illness. And this is a real good example right here where certain aspects of African culture do not see depression as a biological entity, even though we can say, yes, serotonin contributes to this, mood elevating neurotransmitters contribute to this. It's a biological kind of a function. So they would treat it differently. And you could see this, you could read this yourself. The Cooper study of 72, New York psychiatrists are twice as likely to diagnose patients with schizophrenia than in London study. I think we mentioned this one earlier. Or a study similar to it. Okay. Different countries, the third item down here, right here. Different countries use different diagnosis tools. Some use the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-9, or 10, I should say. The CCMD is, I believe, the Canadian version. Don't quote me on it. But the DSM, over here, the last notation right here, this one is an American, and we use a different standard than some of the others. Let's get another one example right here. Homosexuality was considered to be abnormal until the DSM Volume 3 in 1980 came out. And in many countries, it's still considered to be abnormal behavior. Another instance that we have here, let me just slide this up a little bit so I can read it myself, is unmarried mothers in the UK and political dissidents in the Soviet Union were once confined to institutions for abnormality. Now, the British one was a phenomenon you saw in the late 1700s, around the time that we'd won our independence from Great Britain. This was a thing that they would do. If you were an unmarried woman, you were considered to be eligible to be confined in an institution for abnormality. The tendency for American black slaves in the 1800s to try to flee captivity was considered to be a mental illness. How do you like that one? You find that one in many primary source readings in history today. They could not seem to understand why a slave would want to be free. Why not stay in captivity where they were taken care of? I put quotation marks around taken care of. It is claimed that psychiatry was also used to silence political dissidents in China. And that is true. Call them crazy. North Korea does it. Yeah, North Korea does it. Many instances of that. So this is just an example how different cultures handle this. All right, social problems, pressures, and the culture differences that may lead to a higher prevalence of disorders in some cultures. And here we're looking at a Becker study of 95. After the introduction of television in Fiji, an island in the South Pacific, eating disorders in women increased. Suicide is more common in poorer countries. Speaking of suicide in poorer countries or in countries in general, recently in the news, people in Canada up in the far north, and I think it's the province of Quebec, or maybe it's the province of Nunavut, which is way up north. There has been an increase, a disproportionate increase in the number of not just single suicides, but the number of mass suicides. We're ending up with a high influx of people committing suicide in pairs or in small group. And this has got the health industry, the mental health industry of Canada, deeply concerned. And you should know that these, we call them here in the United States Native Americans. They're called First People, I think they are in Canada. But the Indians, we'll just go for a common denominator here. The Indians of Canada are a poor lot, isolated lot, and suffering from cultural diffusion, lack of cultural integration, and these may later on, under a study, contribute to the higher rise of depression. In this next study here, the 2010 study by Chow and Blinsky, depression is associated with individualism. Individualism is negatively correlated with the frequency of the short allele related to serotonin transporters. Another biological here. In cultures with high levels of community religiosity and traditional family roles, depression is less prevalent. Here we see the argument between family plays a role in preventing, maybe family plays a stronger role in maintaining our sanities. Yeah. All right. Why are there gender differences in prevalence of disorder? There's great genetic differences between men and women and susceptibility for a disorder. I'll go back to an earlier study I quoted in this particular short lesson. There are cultural differences in expectation of men and women which contribute to different disorders. Speaking only as a man and having raised 3 girls, I can speak only a little bit for them, but not completely. Men have different roles thrust upon us in this culture. We have different expectations as the man. As the oldest man, the man of the house, the husband, the father. Different roles as the oldest female in a household. Different expectations and roles as a mother. And I think I've said this to you guys in class before. Who will always be the primary caregiver in any relationship when there is an equal role between a man and a woman and they have a child? And the answer is almost everyone. It'll be the woman that has the role as primary caregiver to any child that comes into their lives. And that role does not end at age 18. I can attest to it through my wife, who we don't have a single 18-year-old at all. Our youngest is 21. And to be very honest with you, she is still very much the caregiver to all of the kids, the 30-year-old all the way down to the 21-year-old. Cultural variations and the prevalence of bulimia. Now, in this, and I'm sorry about this, the study guide doesn't give us a great deal of material on this. You're better off discussing just depression, really, and hit upon bulimia as just a side thought, because that's what the book did here, too. Cultural variations in the prevalence of bulimia. Cultural beliefs and attitudes have been identified as factors leading to the development of eating disorders. Etiology, it's called. Bulimia was first identified and classified as a specific disorder in 1979. I thought it was in the 1980s, but 1979, that's the source. So when I was growing up, when I had gone to high school in 1975, and I think I mentioned in an earlier lecture, the Carpenters were very popular. It was the group, the brother and sister group. And Karen Carpenter developed bulimia and or anorexia, and it wasn't classified as an eating disorder. She saw herself as just being fat. And so, in essence, she had a poor body image. And so, it wasn't until 1975 that we really started identifying it as its own standalone disorder. But even then, it wasn't until probably the late 80s that we really started taking it to heart. In the next study, the Mankino study of 2004, they talk about the prevalence rates of bulimia, and you have 0.3% to 7.3% in women and 0% to 2.1% in men in most Western cultures. And there is always a small difference. Men don't suffer from this as much as women do. Men don't have, very few men have body image issues. 0.46 to 3.2% in women in non-Western cultures. I'm sorry I did not have any statistics for men in those non-Western cultures. Probably unreported or probably very limited. The idea here is the explanation for these variations is the Western hypothesis presented by Rubenstein and Calero. And let's see here. This is that eating disorders seem to have become more common among younger females after the Second World War. Let me see if it's on the next page here. Okay, let's go on. So it seemed to become more common among younger females after the Second World War, when female beauty ideals have gradually become thinner. This is reflected in the increase of articles on dieting in women's magazines in the same period, as well as a thinner icon of female beauty. Miss America, Barbies. Take a look at anyone, with very little exception, any one of a host of female role models that Disney has put forth. Okay, with very little exception. Very little exception. Okay, they present to you almost an unattainable body image. Okay, one explanation for the development of eating disorders such as bulimia in non-Western countries is the perceived social pressure to conform to the standard of the female beauty imposed by modern industrial society or Western culture. Think of Japan prior to World War II. Most women conformed to a certain dress and custom. Think of Japan post-war, slowly but surely making the transition. Think of Japan post-Vietnam era, and we find more and more women really taking off with Western dress and attitude. Take a look at Japan today, and you find more Western ideas, more Western thoughts, more Western attitude. Okay? So one could say that Japan has become more corruptible because of Western idealism. And as a result of that, could not we have exported our own mental disorders associated with our own Western society to the Japanese and others that wish to emulate us? It's a question. Okay. All right. So there are cultural differences in expectations of men and women which contribute to different disorders. This goes back to the Becker study. I think I'm repeating myself here. Yeah, I am. I already wrote this down once before. Okay. So this is the end of it. And this is discussing cultural and gender variations and prevalence of disorders. This, the command term discuss is a level 3 command term. You're not likely going to see this question as it is. No, you'll see it. I'm sorry. Level 3. Yeah, that's a hard one. Discuss. Yeah, you might see it on your May exam. So be prepared to answer it. And it'll probably ask you discuss cultural and gender variations in one disorder as far as prevalence goes, in one disorder. And you've got a lot of ammunition here to write a real good essay here. Okay? I will go ahead and close this out and get this ready for export. And so today is Wednesday. I don't know that I'll make one for tomorrow, but yeah, I might be able to put out 5.7 for tomorrow. and we'll see what we could do, and we'll go on from there. In 5.7, we're going to be talking about examine biomedical, individual, and group approaches to treatment. This is an interesting. Now we've finished describing disorders. In learning outcome 5.7, we start talking about treatment. 5.8, we're going to evaluate the use of biomedical and individual group approaches in treating. So we're going to describe them in 5.7. 5.8, we're going to talk about how effective they are. In 5.9, we're going to discuss the use of eclectic approaches to treatment. That's those oddball kind of treatments, okay? But they don't mean that. It's this term, it's not different. It's eclectic means combinations, okay? Sorry about that. I always forget that every year. And then finally, in 5.10, we're going to discuss the relationship between etiology and therapeutic approaches in relationship to one particular disorder. So I will talk to you real soon. All right? Bye.